impossibility. She's a must to avoid, better take it from me.
So the talk of the town now is face masks, whether we should be wearing them or not. I've got this article here from the OCLA, Ontario Civil Liberties Association. OCLA asks who to retract recommendation advising use of face masks in general population. OCLA has sent a letter to the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, asking him to retract the WHO's recommendation advising the use of face masks in the general population to prevent BS19 transmission. The letter criticises the lack of a valid scientific basis for the WHO's recommendation and expresses OCLA's concerns about serious harms to individuals and societies stemming from the recommendation and from government impositions of face masks on the general public. The letter includes statements such as, the WHO cannot collect and rely on potentially biased studies to make recommendations that can have devastating effects on the lives of literally billions. Rather, the WHO must apply a stringent standards threshold and accept only randomized controlled trials with verified outcomes. In this application, the mere fact that several such quality studies have not ever confirmed the positive effects reported in bias-susceptible reports should be a red flag. And it is an unjustified authoritarian imposition and a fundamental indignity to have the state impose its evaluation of risk on the individual, one which has no basis in science and which is smaller than a multitude of risks that are both common and often created or condoned by the state. Goes on here. I'll put a link in the description so you can read this for yourself. It's like 9 pages long. It's addressed to Dr. Tedros. I am going to skip down to like page 6. I just want to read you something there. You can read this all for yourself, but I'm going to start here. Under the potential benefits/advantages, you incorrectly claim that likely advantages include reduced potential exposure risk from infected persons before they develop symptoms. How this can be a likely advantage in a total absence of reliable data is beyond comprehension. Your other likely advantages include reduced potential stigmatism of individuals wearing masks to prevent infecting others, making people feel they can play a role in contributing to stopping spread of the virus, reminding people to be compliant with other measures, e.g. hand hygiene, not touching nose and mouth, potential social and economic benefits. Amidst the global shortage of surgical masks and PPE, encouraging the public to create their own fabric masks may promote individual, enterprise and community integration. Moreover, the production of non-medical masks may offer a source of income for those able to manufacture masks within their communities. Fabric masks can also be a form of cultural expression, encouraging public acceptance of protection measures in general. Your document next has the section entitled Potential Harms/Disadvantages, in which you state, the likely disadvantages of the use of masks by healthy people in the general public include potential increased risk of self-contamination due to the manipulation of a face mask and subsequently touching eyes with contaminated hands. Potential self-contamination that can occur if non-medical masks are not changed when wet or soiled. This can create favourable conditions for microorganisms to amplify. Potential headache and or breathing difficulties depending on type of mask use. Potential development of facial skin lesions, irritant, dermatitis or worsening acne when used frequently for long hours. Jeez, it sure sounds like the disadvantages far outweigh the supposed advantages, but I'll keep going. Difficulty with communicating clearly. Then we go here. Waste management issues, improper mask disposal leading to increased litter in public places, risk of contamination to stress cleaners and environment hazard. On their face, the harms that you describe are more severe than the benefits. Therefore, we are all more perplexed by your recommendation, which has no basis in reliable scientific results. You are correct to point out that masks are collectors and concentrators of pathogen-laden substances and materials in close proximity to the mouth, nose and eyes, such that one might expect contact transmission to occur by way of the said concentration. A day of collecting pathogens on the mask by inhalation, accompanied by mask touching and followed by mask removal and disposal or storage, indeed does not sound like a good idea. Can the general public realistically be expected to learn and follow medical protocols of masks safely? Most reliable trials have been made with professional healthcare workers and found no measurable benefit of masks. Would masks make things worse in the general population? We don't know. But virtually the entire public establishment, including the WHO, used to think so. Okay, I'll leave it at that. You can read the whole thing for yourself, but clearly, even from the WHO's mouth, the disadvantages far outweigh the likely advantages. Likely advantages, a lot of bullshit. So we know it. The masks are useless. They're useless. If they were, of any use, they would have had them from day one, and not 4 months in, when things are sort of, flattening out. Oh, hang on, there's a second wave coming. So now we're going to all of a sudden wear a mask. Stick your mask up your ass. I ain't going to wear one. Just tell them, if someone in a shopping, supermarket, whatever, says, sorry, you can't come in because you're not wearing a mask, just say, sorry, I've got a medical exemption. And they say, what's that? It says, none of your business. It's private. And then ask them for their name and number as a record, and just see how long they continue. Just say you report them for asking personal information that's got nothing to do with them. It's private and confidential, and anything that's to do with your health history has got nothing to do with some idiot security guard, whatever, in a supermarket, So just do that. Tell them you got a medical exemption, and if they ask you what is it, just say it's personal. It's got nothing to do with you, and ask them for their name and number, and see how far that continues. And from the good old ABC Australia Bullshit Corporation, of course they're going to show Donald Trump wearing a mask. Oh, so we all got to wear one now. Just want to go down here. What are the risks associated with wearing a mask? According to the federal government, there are risks associated with wearing a mask. It says, touching the mask during use or when removing it can contaminate the hands. Masks are less effective if they become damp or damaged. Many commercially available masks are of low quality. PT or N95 masks should not be used as they are difficult to put on and take off safely. They have been found to provide a false sense of security. The use of a mask, and only a mask, will not prevent infection as explored above. So there's quite a few risks involved, not to mention that they are just germ carriers. If this so-called virus was stopped by the mask and it sits on your mask, you fiddle it around with your hands like people tend to do, then you go to rub your nose, your eyes, your mouth, whatever, because you've got the supposed virus sitting on the mask. When you take it off, put it back on, whatever, you're touching this virus all the time. Not only that, you're going to be catching other bacteria, live bacteria. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, I think that's enough.
This is Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth, and we have a very important show lined up for you today, my friends. We're going to be looking deep into the science behind wearing a mask and the fact that it is not good for you. They do not work. We're going to be basing this off of this paper that was recently put out called Masks Don't Work. a review of science relevant to COVID-19 social policy. And joining me on the line to discuss this important paper is the author of the paper, Denny Rancourt. He is a scientist, a PhD, a former professor of physics at the University of Ottawa. So Denny, thank you so much for taking some time to join us here today to talk about this important subject that you've been covering lately. Now, I want to get your views on the masks, but in this current climate, it's actually quite controversial today. On one side of the spectrum, you have people saying, if you don't wear a mask, you are in favor of killing grannies. And on the very opposite side of the spectrum, you have people say, well, if you do, you're just a sheeple who's not questioning authority and falling in line. And then in the middle, you have some people who just don't really know. They're really not sure on what the science actually is behind this. So let's just start with what prompted you in such a heated climate today to try to kind of clear the muddied waters when it comes to the science behind wearing a mask.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Dan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been doing this research on masks and COVID and the science of COVID for many months now. I started early on, as soon as I could. I immediately saw at the very beginning, before masks were even a thing, I saw that there was a real occasion for me to say something about the science of masks, to review it quickly and get it out there that masks do not work. So I did that right away. And then I've continued my research as a researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association and uncovered some other pretty fundamental points about this COVID-19 thing as well. But so it's just part of my research. It's part of what I do. I try to elucidate the science for people on important civil rights and societal issues. That's what I do.
Now, you've discovered that through looking at the case studies that they simply do not work, yet we have various health officials here in Canada and others around the world claiming that it does. I mean, are they just wrong, or are they lying, or are they maybe misguided with the information?
I don't know what they're doing. They're out of it. They're out of touch with the science that's been done. I mean, it's very, very clear cut. There have been many randomized controlled trials with verified outcomes. That's what we call it, when you actually verify whether the person was infected, not just call them on the phone and say, did you have the sniffles the day after, and that kind of thing. So there are studies like that are that bad. But if you do it properly, kind of the standard to avoid bias, observational bias and selection bias, selection of the person, if you do it properly and you look at these, there have been many such trials done over the last decade, and none of them have found an advantage in terms of reducing the risk of a viral respiratory disease, an advantage to wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask. And it goes further than that. They don't see any difference between a high-performing mask, such as a so-called respirator N95, and just a regular surgical mask. They see there have been many randomized controlled trials comparing just those two with fairly large groups, and they don't detect a difference, okay? So, and this was done in community settings, but also in healthcare settings. And there's, like I said, many. So I reviewed them all. And there have been, in addition to that, what are called meta-analyses, which is looking at all of these studies as groups, as select groups. Everyone who does it properly in a way to avoid scientific bias will tell you that they cannot detect an advantage to wearing a mask. Now, if you can't detect the advantage when you design a study to try to detect the advantage, it means that any advantage has to be very small. And so it sets a lower limit on how effective they can be. And this point is completely above their heads. The health officials won't even mention it. They won't talk about it. And another thing that's important to realize in this context is that, a viral respiratory disease, there's a whole bunch of different viruses that act essentially in the same way. They're transmitted by aerosol particles through the air. They transmit high transmissivity during the winter season, then it drops off in the summer because aerosol particles are not stable in humid air. They're only stable in a low absolute humidity environment. So this is all really well-known stuff. And coronaviruses are no different than influenza viruses in that regard. The cold transmits in this way. So it's garbage science to start saying that you can't look at all the studies we've done in the past because this is some new strain of a coronavirus. That's just nonsense thinking, because it's the same physics, it's the same biology. You have a droplet aerosol that carries the minimal infective dose. You breathe it into your lungs. That's how you get infected, period. They're all extremely contagious diseases. You have what's called a winter burden of deaths every winter in the mid-latitude countries where the air is dry. And the deaths from that, the total winter burden, is always about the same. It's been the same for the last 30, 40, 50 years. We've been measuring it accurately. I could show you a graph if you want to see what that graph looks like. But the winter burden deaths in this latest season, the so-called COVID case, has been statistically equivalent to what we've seen the last 30 or 40 years. All right. So this was not a killer. There is nothing special happening. It's one of many viruses that cause these viral respiratory diseases. And there is nothing special in terms of its virulence, nor in terms of how it is transmitted. And this is why there are no deaths anymore in the summer right now. You can talk about cases and you can say that you're detecting cases, but that's a lot of nonsense. You have to look at deaths, and you can't be biased in how you attribute the cause of death. And the way to avoid that is to look at all-cause deaths. And the data is very clear. When you look at all-cause deaths, it's a function of look, either COVID is not causing a lot of deaths, or it's causing a lot of deaths and the other causes of deaths have disappeared, because the total deaths are the same as they ever have been, okay?
Right.
So this is not something that is debatable. This is hard data that's not subject to bias of interpretation. Okay.
Well, I want to get into these numbers in terms of people who have died with COVID-19 as opposed to dying of COVID-19. But before we jump into that, I would just like to touch back on the fact that you said that there are no advantages currently that your study has found to wearing a mask in the pandemic. But it begs the question: is there a possible disadvantage that these harmful particles could just be affecting you even worse now because of the mask?
Oh, absolutely. The World Health Organization itself admits some very serious and worrisome disadvantages to recommending masks for the general population. And in fact, all the health organizations around the world did not previously make this recommendation for precisely those reasons, because of the damages that can occur. One of the main ones is that the mask collects these pathogen-laden materials on the fibers near your face. So you concentrate it by breathing near your face and eyes and nose and mouth. Okay, that right there, that can't be a great idea. And then you're constantly touching the mask and rubbing your nose and rubbing your eyes and touching other things and so on. So you're necessarily touching the mask that you wear. You're adjusting it, you're putting it on, taking it off, pulling it down to talk to someone, pulling it back up. This is what people do. So that danger has been noticed as a potential. It's never been verified scientifically in a true controlled setting, but the danger is believed to be there, and it was enough to cause everyone to not make such a recommendation. So what we have to understand is this new recommendation of masks in the general public is a draconian measure. It's never been recommended before. And these dangers have always been put out there as real potential dangers. People also get skin problems because of the mask. It's harder to breathe, which is not a negligible thing, because if you're wearing the mask a lot in the humid weather of the summer, it gathers humidity, makes it harder to breathe. So these are very significant effects. And there was one randomized controlled study with health workers that showed that wearing an N95, the one outcome they did find is that these healthcare workers got far more headaches, serious headaches from doing that than the colleagues that were not wearing them, okay? So impairing someone's breathing and for a long time during the day outside in the sun, it can't be a good idea. So these are the dangers that are admitted by the World Health Organization when they make the recommendation of masks. And the only advantages that they claim might be present is that it prevents source infection. So they're not even trying to claim that it prevents you from getting the infection, you know, barring the entry. They're claiming that it's the only advantage they're claiming is that you have asymptomatic people who don't know to stay at home, who are out there. So everybody better wear a mask because you might be one of those persons, and that the mask will somehow prevent these transmissive particles from getting out of you and infecting others, which is a ridiculous notion because none of these studies have seen such an effect. You know, and if you think about it, you can reason it as well in terms of the physics and the biology of it. The smallest size fractions of these aerosol particles is what's responsible for the transmissivity. Okay, that's been known for a decade. All of these viral respiratory diseases are the same. That's why there's a seasonal dependence of transmissivity because of that. So these particles are very fine and they follow the flow of air. So as soon as you have openings on the side of the mask or anything, that's where the air, that's the lowest impedance part where the flow will be. And the particles are coming in and out just as easily. So it's ridiculous that a cloth mask could have any effect. If it doesn't protect you from inhaling, it's not going to prevent those very same particles that infect you from getting out as well.
And what would you say is the importance of obtaining herd immunity, and is not mandating masks going to actually help with that?
You know, you don't have to plan to get herd immunity. Everyone's going to get it. You know, we're going to have it as a society. These are extraordinarily contagious diseases. They're not lethal, but they're very contagious. So everyone who can potentially get it through the transmission through these aerosol particles is going to be exposed, and their immune system will handle it, and that their immune system will have a memory of that particular pathogen, and it will help them in the future, and it will help them with similar viruses as well, because there's a kind of cross immunity that occurs. So this is how we have been living with viruses for 5 million years, you know, our ancestors till present. They've always been around. There's always been a huge array of these types of viruses that cause respiratory diseases. And for breathing animals, it's 300 million years. So these viruses have been with us forever. And the immune system, this extraordinarily powerful system that we have, has been co-adapting with these viruses forever. This is the natural thing. And now you can ask, well, but people die. That's true. There is a winter burden mortality every single winter in mid-latitude countries because that's when transmissivity is high. And it's the people that have comorbidity conditions, the people that are already in a fragile state, when they get invaded with this infection and their immune system has to get a lot of metabolic energy to kick in and to really do a lot of the things it has to do, that is a high demand on the person's body. And it's a question of survival. So the body will actually shut down other functions and so on in order to handle that. And that's when you become very fragile. If you have other infections or other conditions, you can die from that. That's what this is about. It's always been that way. And that's what's going on.
So, well, putting the mask issue aside for now, let's take a little bit of a closer look on what's actually scaring people into wearing these masks in the first place, and that is the death numbers. And according to, I mean, the mask paper isn't the only one you put out. You put out a few papers now, and you can talk at great lengths to the inaccuracy of the death count numbers. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, you know what? I want to show you a graph. So I'm gonna pull back here and get a graph just so you have a visual understanding of what I'm talking about. Okay. I think you can probably see that. That's for the USA as a function of time in years that you can see there. And this is all case mortality total. So the baseline is very high, and there's a variation season to season. That's the extra hump that you see here. So the area under the hump, this is all-cause mortality by week. That means that the area under the hump is the total mortality for that winter season, okay? And you can see that from year to year, the area under the hump is always about the same. The shapes change and so on. This is the latest one. Now, this latest one for the USA total has this very sharp feature late in the season, which I've called the COVID peak. the area of it is not particularly big because it's very narrow, okay? So it doesn't change the overall, but it is an odd feature which is not natural. It's not a natural feature. And that feature only occurs in certain jurisdictions and not in others. So there are large states in the USA that had as many infections, as many cases reported, like Texas and California, very large states that do not have that peak. New York has it. Now you can go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and see the peaks that have it in Europe and so on. And what is stunning about this peak is that it kicks in at exactly synchronously the same time everywhere, exactly immediately after the World Health Organization announced the pandemic and recommended that the states prepare their hospitals by freeing up the intensive care units in order for the, in order to prepare for this tsunami that was supposed to happen.
Right.
Of cases coming in of people that were dying. So jurisdictions, some jurisdictions did that, and they did it aggressively, and they did it in a way that put people at risk. So I argue in my paper, in that particular paper from which this graph is taken, that there was an acceleration of the deaths of immune vulnerable people that occurred because of government interventions. And I detailed the kinds of interventions that are likely to kill people en masse in that way. And so that article came out recently. And the title of that article is All-Cause Mortality During COVID-19, No Plague, and a Likely Signature of Mass Homicide by Government Response. And I think it's the first paper that showed that this peak was synchronous around the world, exactly when the pandemic was announced. And it is an unnatural peak. There's nothing like it has ever been seen before. You can look at 30 or 40 or 50 years of these curves, and you never see a sharp peak that's this sharp in terms of the full width at half maximum, and you never see any sharp feature this late in the season of infectiousness,
right?
Okay, and you never see something that is synchronous everywhere. You can see a sharp peak in the United States, but when you look at European countries, it's not there. It looks different. It's a little bit shifted. It's in a different place, or it doesn't occur. This peak, when it does occur, is always at the same place, always 3 or 4, sometimes 5 weeks wide in terms of the full width at half maximum. And it is not a natural peak. It is directly caused by accelerating the deaths of these vulnerable people, locking them into the institutions, stressing them out with fear, not letting their families see them, locking them into an environment that contains the aerosol particles in suspension, making sure everybody gets infected. And this is how they killed people. And the stress is not negligible in this regard, because this kind of stress, when you separate people from their family, their routines, you take away the care personnel, and you tell them that there's this horrible pandemic out in the world, that kind of stress on an elderly person is devastating to immune response and in terms of causing disease.
Well, where do you see this going from here? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but given the things that you do know, where do you see this moving? I mean, a lot of these guys are talking about this second wave coming now, and a lot of people are wondering what that may actually look like. And
there's no question that there's going to be a winter wave. There always is one. Okay, so you can call it a second wave if you want to argue that it's the same viral strain that is mostly the one causing the next one. You can call it a second wave if you want, but for sure this phenomenon is just going to continue, and the only thing that will change it are these mass draconian interventions, and they'll only make things worse. I don't see any evidence of any of these measures ever making things better, but there's plenty of evidence of making it worse. So there's going to be another wave, if you like. And it's important to notice as well that because of the transmissivity mechanism, the infectious season in the southern hemisphere is during our summer, okay? Because that's when they have winter, and that's when the air is dry there. So everyone's freaking out right now that South Africa is getting a lot of cases. That's normal.
Right.
That's always the case. If you had measured any cold and flu season, you would see the same thing. And, you know, the other point is that in the equatorial countries, this phenomenon does not exist. They're always humid, essentially more than us in terms of absolute humidity. And this transmissivity is not high there. So you can decide that you're going to vaccinate everyone in Africa, but you're really just, you know, you're selling useless vaccines, and you're harming people in that way, because this is a well understood viral respiratory disease phenomenon, and it is well understood how and why it only occurs in mid-latitude nations and territories. Okay, so these are all things that are brilliant experts that work for the government somehow don't mention. You know, they talk about, oh my God, what's going to happen when it hits Africa? They talk about, oh, look, there's an increase now in South Africa. They say all this garbage without the scientific context. The scientific context is this has been happening forever, and this was not a killer pandemic. Nothing happened other than the craziness that humans did. That's it.
All right. Well, moving forward, I guess my last question is, what sort of words of advice might you have for society moving forward? Because as I said, we're in a highly controversial climate. People are at each other's throats over this, policing one another, and you know, getting in fights at the airport and so on. And as you said, more is coming. What sort of advice do you have for people moving forward here?
Well, the Ontario Civil Liberties Association put out a memo recommending peaceful civil disobedience on the mask question. So when it comes to shopping and being in a park or being anywhere indoors or in a bus or anything, we're recommending peaceful civil disobedience. And we put out a procedural guide for that, in which we explain not to argue with people, not to argue with authorities, simply show that you oppose it by refusing to do it. And you don't have to do it all the time and every time. Use your judgment, you know, but practice some civil disobedience, and practice it peacefully, and not as an excuse to have arguments with people, and not as a way to get into these kinds of battles or anything, but just make it clear to authorities and to the people around you that you yourself as an individual has decided that the risk is not what the government says, and that you've made your own risk evaluation based on your personal experience, on your personal knowledge, on your reading, and you have decided not to wear a mask. You see, because risk evaluation is a very personal thing. And we do it every time, before we go outside, before we go on a trip, before we accept a treatment, whatever we do, we are always making our own risk evaluation. But this is a case where the government is imposing its risk evaluation on us in the absence of a scientific basis for it. So it's kind of crazy. Now, the other thing I can say in the longer term, I think that we have to oppose these measures and show that we oppose them now, just to slow down this crazy march that is essentially a slow degradation towards a totalitarian state, I believe. And so we have to slow it down by opposing it. But in the long term, I think what's going to happen in the medium or long term is that, you know, this pandemic zoo is just going to run its course and run out. People are just going to get tired of hearing that we're going to die every 5 minutes, and that we're going to die because of this particle or this fomite or this and that. Now there's a new strain, now it's mutated, and so on. You know, people like any animal, they get used to these kinds of calls. You know, the monkeys who scream because they saw a shadow in the woods and everybody runs up in the trees, if they run up 3 times in a row and looked and there was nothing, they've come back down, they're not going to run up as quickly next time. There's kind of a habituation. So this happened with the global warming frenzy. You know, people just got tired of it and were making fun of it, and the government has basically abandoned it for this new crisis. And I think that eventually, no matter how taken we are by fear now, no matter how personally the personal conviction that people put into believing in these stupid masks and this danger that doesn't exist, that in the sense that it's not an abnormal danger, nonetheless, in the longer term, people will just get tired of it. in the meantime, they're going to profit from it as much as they can. They're going to change institutions, rules, laws, try to make a lot of money from it, increase their influence and grab on power and on actual physical things that they own more and more all the time. So, but we can claw that back. We can ratchet it back as we see more and more that this has gone too far. We will get tired of this craziness. I think the human animal will get tired of it.
Yes, I agree, and I think this is why we need to continue to cut through the propaganda and show these people the real science, the real information behind this. Because, as you say, I think they are getting fed up with the lies coming from the mainstream, and this is why the alternative independent media is starting to become the mainstream, because people realize this fact. And this is why I want to thank you for putting together these very important papers so people can really understand the science behind it. Where's the best place for people to go if they want to actually read the studies themselves?
Okay, well, I think that if you go to ocla.ca, which is the Ontario Civil Liberties Association website, and look at the right column, you can click on one of the latest actions was this letter that we wrote to the World Health Organization Director General. That is a 9-page letter that cites all the recent scientific studies on masks, but also cites my papers that relate to some of the questions we were talking about. Perfect. So that might be a good place to start. And also my my page on ResearchGate has this big paper that I was just telling you about now.
Perfect. Well, I strongly encourage the viewers of this channel to check it out. Links will be located in the description below. Guys, give it a read. Not only that, digest the info, let it sink in, and share it with your friends and family so that moving forward, we don't fall into this totalitarian, authoritarian state. So once again, Denny, thank you so much for your work. Keep it up, and thanks for talking to us today.
Thanks, Dan. It was a pleasure.